That showed exactly 7 seconds on the clock.
Councillor Dosey's got his hand up.
Can you hear me, Councillor Doze?
I can hear you, sir. Thank
What
you.
are you pointing at your ears for?
He wants you to know that he can hear you.
Oh,
Perfect.
can we hear you?
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh, now we got Councillor Youssef.
I believe you can. I can hear you guys now. I'm okay. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Youssef, you can hear us? A thumbs up. Can we hear you? You need to speak.
We checked earlier.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, we will, we'll get started, as we have quorum, I'll call the meeting to order. The time is 11:01 and welcome to our council workshop for June 11th. Always like to start the meeting off in a great way by acknowledging that the city of Maple Ridge carried out its business under traditional and unceded territory of the Katzie First Nation and the Kwantlen First Nation. Madam Clerk, is there anything you'd like to? No, you wouldn't. Okay, we're gonna move on to the next item. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda, please? Moved by Councillor Schiller, seconded by Councillor Jewick. Any comments or additions? Seeing none, call a question. All those in favor? Motion is carried unanimously. Thank you. Next item up is the adoption of the minutes from May 28th, 2024. Can I get a motion for this item, please? Moved by Councillor Schiller, seconded by Councillor Jewick. Any errors, omissions? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor, motion is carried unanimously. Thank you very much. And then we're going to move on to presentations. We have item 5.1, Maple Ridge Housing Society, financial analysis of housing incentives in Maple Ridge. And who do we have? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Mayor and Council. So this first item is going to be a part of the conversation that we're having on our housing needs report and housing strategy. So the topic of today is really to deep dive into the financial analysis behind what's going to make the housing incentives tick in the Maple Ridge context. So to have this conversation, I will be handing it over to our consultants. So we have Matt from Urban Matters and Jody and Justin from Urban Systems. And the floor is now yours.
Great, thank you. So if we can go to the next slide. I will just start us off. Just a quick bit of background. Thank you again for your time today. We've been, Urban Matters has been to council workshop a couple of times to present on some of the findings from the housing needs report draft and provide an overview of the housing strategy. In the last meeting, there was considerable discussion around some of the land economics. So we thought it would be valuable to bring some of my colleagues here who are doing this deeper analysis for questions and comments from council. In terms of an update on the project, the housing needs report is drafted and currently being reviewed by staff. However, provincial regulations have not been finalized and released. So we are waiting on that set of guidelines, which we are hopeful will come this month. But it's always a little bit uncertain with the province. So all the indications point to within the next few weeks, we should have those guidelines to help us finalize that report. But it is sort of functionally done at this point. In a draft form to be reviewed by staff. Similarly, the housing strategy is drafted, and we are taking some final analysis around the OCP capacity and some of the outcomes and comments from today's conversation to integrate into the strategy as recommendations. So those documents are largely done, but we are waiting from some senior government guidance to finalize them. So maybe I'll hand it over to you at this point, Jody, in terms of the background.
Yeah, sounds good. So as part of the development of the housing strategy, we've been identifying different incentive types to do financial testing on. This is to understand the potential incentive that would be available that would impact development viability across different development typologies in the city. And so we identified three main incentive types. You would have seen some of this in Matt's council workshop with you back in April, but the three here that we're reintroducing today is reducing off-street parking requirements, waiving 100% of the municipal development cost charges, and also fast-tracking development approvals through pre-zoning for desired land uses. So this one is slightly different from what you would have seen in the last workshop, where the impacts of reducing the development timeline wasn't as apparent. So here we've taken it one step further and determined, if you were to pre-zone for certain desired land uses, how would that impact development viability? And then there were two additional incentive types that we looked at in terms of accessing alternative financing funding programs for rental housing. So this would be BC Housing and CMHC funding programs, as well as land contribution for the nonprofit housing scenarios. And each of these incentives were tested as individual levers and also as a package in order to understand the overall impact as an illustrative example. So the three development typologies we looked at were mid-rise wood frame apartment. This was 6 stories with market rental and strata. This is located in along a major residential corridor along near 1020 Street. The second one is a same typology, but testing a non-market rental scenario instead. And this is located in the town center plan area along Selkirk Avenue. And then the third is the high-rise concrete apartment. This one, we recognize that the provincial transit-oriented areas do permit densities that are building heights that are lower, so at 8 and 12 stories. But here we've tested 20 stories based on our work in different parts of Metro Vancouver and with speaking with developers. Right now, under the current market conditions, I think the only viable concrete market or concrete apartment would be 18 to 20 stories minimum. So that's why we've tested it here at that height. Yeah, I see a little typo on the screen. I think it's just a font technical issue, but the two main questions that we were trying to answer through this analysis is which incentive is most impactful for encouraging development, particularly from a purpose-built rental housing development perspective. And number two, which incentive type is worth pursuing, either as a single lever or as a combination with other levers. And just as a little refresher here on this graph, the bigger caption there should say wood frame apartment market rental scenarios. You would have seen this graph in the April session, but we refined it further. And what we're showing here is the viability threshold is if we're looking at an internal rate of return of 9% or higher, that's kind of what developers would consider going ahead with projects if it met that threshold. So we've modeled our testing under both current market conditions and also improved. The improved market conditions means we tested it interest rates and loans at a 1% interest rate lower than current market conditions. That's to understand how things could change in the future. And right now, you know, viability is challenged across both market conditions, but the point of this exercise is to understand if we have the right preconditions in place, how could we encourage more housing development when the market conditions become better. And so here, you'll see that scenario 1C, CMHC apartment construction loan, that is you know, something that's not directly within the municipality's control, but for parking reduction, waiving municipal development cost charges and pre-zoning, those are all three incentives that we looked at. And so the first one, off-street parking reduction, if we're reducing parking requirements by 30%, it is having the greatest impact on decreasing project costs, at least in this market rental scenario. So if we're going from 1.7 to 1.2 stalls per unit, we are seeing a project cost decrease of 5 to 6%. For the non-market scenario, we had modeled something even lower, going from 1.7 to 1.05 stalls per unit, and this decreases project cost by 10%. And at zero parking, just as an illustrative example, we know there are different challenges and considerations with this. The overall project cost would decrease by 15 to 20%. And as I mentioned earlier, flexible parking requirements can allow the market to respond to parking needs. So whether we understand that transit is not well distributed in the city of Maple Ridge, so some users do rely on cars as their main mode of transportation. The second lever that we looked at is waiving development cost charges. So we tested waiving 100% waiver municipal DCCs. And out of the main levers, this has the second biggest reduction on project costs. This decreased the overall project cost by 2%. One thing to note here is that DCC waivers are a direct cost to government. They are a source of revenue basically to fund infrastructure. And so they do need to be carefully budgeted and accounted for in terms of project livability. And it's not a commonly implemented practice for purposeful rental projects across Metro Vancouver right now, but it is one lever that is available as an incentive. The third incentive that we looked at is the rezoning. So I mentioned earlier that this is removing the rezoning requirement and fast tracking the approvals for certain desired land uses. And so this had the most smallest relative impact on decreasing overall project costs. When we're going from 24 months to 8 months for development approvals, this decreases project costs by just 1%. One thing to note here that is sort of difficult to quantify is that for a developer, having free zoning provides them with a certain level of certainty. So in some cases, it might mean that the viability threshold that they're willing to go forward with the project is less than 9%. So that's just something to keep in mind. And also consideration with pre-zoning is that, of course, it requires pre-planning. There are consequences if I mean, infrastructure servicing upgrades that need to be considered in order for pre-zoning to be applied. And so some of the key takeaways for us when we're going back to that key question number 1 is which incentive is most impactful for encouraging development. When we look at market rental, we do see that off-street parking reduction going from 1.7 to 1.2 stalls per unit has the biggest impact on overall development viability. This is because reducing parking has a twofold impact. At first, it decreases development costs, but also we understand that soil conditions in some parts of Maple Ridge may be cost prohibitive for developers who are building deeper than 2 stories underground for parking. So this would just open up some of those development opportunities. In terms of the non-market rental scenario, again, off-street parking reduction does have the biggest decrease if we are moving it to 1.05 stalls per unit. And this also supports affordability when we're looking at co-locating these in proximity to services and walkable areas within Maple Ridge. When we're looking at question 2, which incentive type is worth pursuing either individually as a single lever or in combination with other levers? There are different ways and lenses that we can analyze this question, but the way we looked at it is through which lever has the biggest cost reduction. And so when we're looking at the market rental scenario, combination 1 of offering parking reductions for development applications that are also pursuing CMHC apartment construction loan, that's really impactful. Alternatively, combination 2 is combining pre-zoning for market rental in areas that this land use is desired and offer parking reductions in conjunction with that. Especially if the development applications are pursuing that CMHC funding, that would show the highest reduction in costs.
If I may just jump into, I think one thing worth noting about the CMHC financing is that it does require a proportion of the units to be below market as well. So by requiring you getting the purpose-built market and then a component of non-market as well.
Eric, can I just ask a question, going back to the TMHC? What is the process? Because if we were to go there, then we would actually need to know if they've actually applied for that and successfully got that, correct? So what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Like, how did that process work?
Well, I was going to say, and I'll pass it over to Justin as well. I mean, I think that if you were to, you'd be applying these packages to developers that have applied. Generally speaking, they've just refunded the program. So there's a whole new, I think they put $14 billion of commitment towards it. So it's fairly open and flexible. We've heard that generally speaking, developers like it because of the interest rates and the long-term amortization. So they prefer to go there oftentimes, even though it comes with a few more government strings, because of the patient capital that comes with it or the patient investment. And so often we find a lot of developers are exploring this. So typically it would be a conversation I think that staff would be having at the application process.
Yeah, and I mean, from the conversations we've had with developers, not just in this market, but across markets, most are saying that without this program, nothing in the rental space is likely to be built in the near term. So in terms of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, if your incentive is the chicken, I think the chicken comes first because we don't really, the CMHC program is not in your direct purview, but we know that it's impactful, and we know that the combination of that with an incentive that you offer would be more impactful. So your piece is the pre-zoning, and then the CMHC program, which, as Matt said, is well funded. We know it's going to be there for a while. We know that under the current interest rate environment, this is how things are getting built in the rental space. It's the two pieces together that will likely be, fairly significant in moving the needle.
And typically, how long does it take to get a positive response from CMHC on that?
I mean, the experience that we've worked with nonprofit developers that have applied for it is. It's a rolling intake, so you can apply, you don't have to apply once a year or whatnot. You can apply kind of when your pro forma is ready and you've done some of your development work. It's hard to give an exact number, but I mean, anywhere from sort of a couple to 4 months, so it's not a long approval time. They do try to put things through. Applications are stronger when pre-zoning is in place. Or zoning has been taken care of, there's no rezoning to do. And when there's a municipal partner that's got incentives as well. So CMHC typically looks more favorably on applications where there are municipal incentives in place too.
I guess the concern I have is because there are different moving pieces to this. If council approves, let's say, market rental combination option 1 and 2. Are they locked into it? So if we say, okay, we're gonna give you a reduction in your parking spaces, right? Where is the line that says you can't go back now? Right? Because if CMHC gives this to you, and I guess, are we gonna have to change the way that we write all this up to ensure that there's no going back from them saying, oh, we got everything we wanted, but now we're gonna start to change some of these things.
Right, I see, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, go ahead.
So maybe a little bit specifically on the process is, so when they come in and they express interest in what they would like to do, they're normally very upfront that they are interested in pursuing a particular funding stream, because we will often see that broken down into how the development is designed, whether it be the market split or sometimes certain building requirements that come through. When rentals involved, we generally have a housing agreement. So that's where we specify the split that would be in alignment with the financial program that they're pursuing. So should they apply and not be successful and therefore need to change their split of how many are above or below, they would have to come back to us and then we would amend the housing agreement. So you would see it if they weren't successful and we have to make that change.
Perfect, that's what I needed to know, thank you.
So this is the non-market slide, non-market rental slide. So when we're looking at this scenario, the combinations that have the largest cost reduction impact are combination option 1, which is applying as many incentives as possible for development applications that are pursuing the BC Housing Community Housing Fund. This is because when we did this analysis, it's telling us that the operating subsidy that's required from BC Housing would be lowered if incentives are provided. And this makes the project more competitive because the BC Housing Fund is a limited fund. And so projects do have to apply through the RFP process. And so this would only make the project more competitive. In combination option 2, land contribution for development applications that are pursuing BC Housing Community Housing Fund. This is because land contribution on its own wasn't showing a huge impact on the operating subsidy needed, but in combination with the BC Housing program, together it becomes that equity for the nonprofit housing provider or whoever the applicant is to be able to continue pursuing the capital grants that are provided through the funding as well as the operating subsidy.
And it should be noted that land contribution, while it may mean municipal land, It may also mean partnering with organizations like faith communities, identifying provincial lands through things like the BC Builds program, right? It's not solely incumbent on the municipality to provide that land, but it's about land partnerships and assessing land viability.
I think we have time for questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Lots to consider here. I know I jumped in and already asked the question I wanted to ask, so I will open up the floor for council. Anybody who wants to ask questions? Councilor Schiller.
Thank you for that information. Can you just explain to me a little bit more about the pre-zoning? I just don't have a great understanding of it. So we look at an area and we say we're trying to focus on this area and provide incentives here, and we're gonna pre-zone this. Then can you just explain to me a little bit more about what the municipality also has to do to make that successful?
Sure, I think this may be Amanda jumping in too. but-
Sure. Do you want me to start and then you can clarify on the incentive side?
Yeah.
So from a process perspective, essentially we would identify certain parts of our neighborhood that are typically currently zoned for single family residential. And the city would move through a process to change its zoning to what we would like to see. So for example, it may go to RM2, could go to RM3, or a brand new zone, depending on some of the work that we're doing. So once you have that zoning in place, it removes the requirement to do those 4 readings of council specifically attached to the rezoning. There would still be a development permit process, so council would still be able to see the application, you'd be informed on what it would look like and what the attributes and if there would be any variances requested. So if they were seeking a variance on, say, the parking requirement because of a financing element, that would still very much come to council. The certainty of it, if you will, is really that reduction in timeline for not having to go through the rezoning process, but you would still have the development permit part. And I believe it isn't necessarily the it's that certainty element that makes it more appealing to developers if you are able to pre-zone. But the flip side is we do lose some powers as a municipality to take road dedication and require servicing upgrades if it is a pre-zone site, because we have limited ability under the development permit. So if this is something that we want to see in very specific areas, it's a very powerful incentive that the city can use, but it also has to be used with care so that we don't necessarily compromise on certain amenities that we would like to bring to the broader community. So that's why it would be a process that's very much council endorsed. You would be able to identify which properties that you would like pre-zoned if we went down that route and to what level of density, and those details would be essentially a separate conversation. So the outcome of the housing strategy work isn't going to say these are where you should pre-zone, but it's more of a, if you are interested in the conversation, take a closer look.
What about infrastructure? You know, if we pre-zone an area and now it's sort of the intention is that it would have a different housing form, then what does that mean to the city in terms of like upgrades that we might proactively?
We would be on the hook for the infrastructure upgrades, so it'd be folded into the capital plan. If there are areas where we are comfortable with the level of servicing provided, we'd be able to identify that to say, this and this, we're good, we've got the room, but this is a piece that would have to upgrade. It's one of those elements that municipalities do struggle with, because if you do have an infrastructure deficit on all fronts, that's a big trade-off conversation. We do have some areas that we are more comfortable with what type of infrastructure capacity we can support there. And that might be a more comfortable place to start, because the trade-off discussion is a little bit less than everything needs to be upgraded and everything needs to be funded by an alternate funding source. Great, thank you.
If I can add a couple other considerations around the pre-zoning. You can institute a density bonusing program through pre-zoning by setting base and maximum densities, and therefore if there's clear policy around things like daycare contributions or other amenity contributions, they can be spelled out in policy. Where the challenge lies currently is with affordable housing as a component of that density bonusing, because no longer can you capture affordable housing through ACCs, this new tool that we've been given. And while inclusionary legislation has been passed by the province, their guide is not out yet. And I think from the timelines I've heard from the province, we're looking at November, but there's an election between now and then. So once the writ drops, that may delay any sort of policy guidance that they're providing to municipalities. So it is a piece that would need to be thought about in terms of the pre-zoning. We probably need to integrate some of that thinking around the inclusionary zoning, and so it might be slightly longer term than kind of this calendar year. If we were to integrate that.
Good,
I'm good for now.
thank you, Councillor Youssef.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to staff and to the consultant for the presentation and report. To continue along the same lines, when we're talking about pre-zoning, would the DCCs charged at that point not cover a portion of, if not all, or the majority of capital projects and infrastructure upgrades that would be required?
Looking at so
That is ultimately why we charge DCCs, so we can have the upgrades and infrastructure in place, correct?
That is correct. So DCCs would fund the portion of infrastructure that is directly attributable to growth.
Okay, and in this case where we are, or we may be pre-zoning, then the growth that would come as a result of it would be subject to DCC charges. Correct?
Yes, because DCCs are collected at either building permit stage or subdivision stage.
Okay, good. I'm a fan of pre-zoning, by the way, just full disclosure. I've seen how the city of Kelowna has done a wonderful job with their downtown core through it, and I believe it's a good tool that we have at our disposal to be able to encourage certain types of developments in certain segments of our municipality. How does Bill 44 and other provincial legislation that's now allowing for single family units to become more dense affect a pre-zoning program if we were to put one in?
I can start and jump in context. Generally speaking, with the focus Bill 44 being on single family homes, what we'd probably be considering would be clustering of either single family lots or low density lots in growth areas that would need to be upzoned would be the target of pre-zoning. So we'd be looking at a slightly higher density form of dwelling type, I think, than would be covered under the SMOO. So it would be sort of that, really it's that missing middle that we'd be thinking about in terms of the pre-zoning, but taking the step beyond the fourplexes and into the kind of townhomes and low-rise apartment condominium.
Just to build on that, so purely from a kind of pro forma financial perspective, what the impact of SMOO could be in certain areas is if it effectively it creates a circumstance whereby the base land value or the as-is value based on what you can now legally do under current zoning may not exceed, but may exceed what the previous value of the site was prior to Bill 44, which would then create a condition where if your preferred development type is, say, a 4-story building or something of a higher density nature, that the financial performance of that higher density building would have to now outperform a higher kind of baseline hurdle than it would have. Now, that's not necessarily going to be the case everywhere. We've seen in our modeling in other municipalities that SMOO allowance or SMOOable allowance lots do not necessarily have a higher value than what they did in their previous state. So that's we did some of this testing in District of Saanich, and some lots did outperform, some did not, but that's just another consideration about that hurdle value that needs to be exceeded.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that clarification. Lastly, through you, Mr. Chair, I'm okay with reducing parking and allowing the market to decide how much parking is required in this case. For the market rental bit, I like combination 2 a bit more than combination 1. And lastly, I am not a fan of waiving DCCs at all. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my comments and questions. Thank you to staff and to the consultant for the clarifications as well.
Thank you, Councillor Ferreras.
Thank you. Okay, so if you can just remind me, what is the new parking that we're passing tonight? We're doing it, or did we do it all?
so confused, I've read so many packages in the last few days. So what they suggest here is 1.7, 1.2, or 1.7 to 1.05, and what is it that, so within the transit oriented areas, we cannot put any minimum. So where else are those areas within the community? Because if we're gonna reduce parking, we really only have very limited areas we could do it where they have access to transit, because reducing parking to 1.0 when there's no transit is a challenge, but also we want the infrastructure.
Yeah. Multi-part answer. So this evening you'll be seeing first, second, and third reading of the POA designation bylaw and the associated off-street
And that's
parking
no
amendment.
parking minimum.
And that is simply saying you can no longer require residential parking in the 3 TOAs.
Yeah.
It is also bringing forward an amendment so that within the prescribed bus station distances, if there's 6 units under the SMA, there's also no parking requirements. Now, to the point that Councillor Youssef was making, the future land value or land use that we would like to see is going to be higher than we would do the analysis. So it's essentially if we added 2 lots together, whatever is valued at higher than 12 units. So when we rezone those properties, taking pre-zoning out of the question, they would go back to our parking requirements set out in our parking bylaw.
And we just reduced. Or we're.
Not quite. So
Okay.
the numbers that were used in this analysis reflect the current. So the 1.7 is in the parking bylaw that you see today.
Okay.
The future, the reduction is the number that we are proposing, or very similar to what we are proposing under the new parking bylaw.
Okay,
The caveat there is that the new parking bylaw, which has received first reading but has not yet come back. So you'll see it again in a couple of months, starts at that 1.2 for market in certain areas and that 1.05 in other areas. The further incentives the developer provides, whether it be market, non-market, even lower non-market, we actually have a reduced parking ratio beyond that. So in some areas, we are suggesting for council's input, almost a 0.6, but that is going to be in very specific housing type. So that element is still up for council input. What this work is essentially saying is that if we were able to support that level of reduction in key areas, again, managing the infrastructure piece, we may be able to further incentivize housing sooner than we would have originally seen in those areas.
But I was just wondering what was our current and how does this change it? But you're saying this is gonna be in line with what we're doing. And what areas would this actually be viable in our community? Because so much of it is done with the TOAs and
Can we
the
flip
new
to that
legislation.
first? So we picked a couple of general locations so that we could use some real world examples. But essentially, we could see this in many intersections throughout the Loki Transit Corridor, as well as within the town center.
I mean, that's where I envision us really the only area.
This isn't necessarily proposed for our more Silver Valley, Albion, et cetera. It's really been intended for those transit oriented areas, not the TOA transit oriented areas, but
And there are some parking stuff coming tonight. I swear.
it's the off-street parking bylaw.
Okay.
Okay, and I know, I've read reports where it gets more challenging the further out you get for the dollars to make sense to have sort of non-market. It becomes more challenging for us in the more urban centers. But I'm curious to see how we can find a way to bridge that, how we can incentivize and encourage folk and how we can support them in bringing in some especially non-market housing. I'm not as concerned around just regular market pieces, but it's the non-market rentals that I'm most concerned about. When it comes to DCCs, I'm really only interested in even thinking about waiving DCCs if it is like an entire building where a significant portion of it is below market and maybe only for the below market pieces of it. I think we're already, as we see later on tonight, we're already subsidizing growth already, and our DCCs don't actually cover what we should be charging for growth. So, that's a huge piece to give up in a community, like you said, that's a big deficit of infrastructure that we need within the community. I do like things when you talked about like incentivizing things around childcare. I still think Maple Ridge is one of the worst ratios for childcare in Metro Vancouver, the last I looked at the report. We have the least amount of spots per capita, which is very concerning and heartbreaking. So those are those other pieces that are interesting for me to look at. I mean, I think we need to look at ways to do it, and I'm looking forward to what comes back.
Finished? Councilor Curry?
Oh, yeah. Stop talking.
Seeing as have no further, Councilor Tam.
Thanks, Mayor. Thank you for this. It's really interesting to see the economic analysis breakdown. A few clarifying questions. Could you just walk me through a little bit more how we did the calculations there, just to make sure I understand? So I saw in the report the assumptions and the method, I think there's an appendix section, and then with a number of like numbers attached to, you know, cost, hard cost, soft cost. But could you just sort of walk me through at an elementary level how we came up with the numbers here?
You wanna take the first question? Or you want me to do it?
Okay, so you're
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, basically the analysis looks at everything cost related to development, minus revenues. And then whatever comes out, and also, we also have to build in developer profit, because that is something developers look for when they're putting in equity and capital into a project. They expect a certain level of return. And so whatever comes out the other end, we measure it through different ways. For market rental, we look at it through internal rate of return. And this is where, like, Justin, you can jump in here.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, so when we look at the market rental, generally speaking, in this market, we're not doing building and selling a whole rental building. Because generally the returns aren't really aligned with that kind of model. You end up with like negative profit in most cases, or yield ratio that's not really viable. So instead what we look at is we model it based on the idea that you're building and holding and operating it for about 10 years minimum. And then the internal rate of return is a metric that looks at basically the cash flow of that project over a period of time, plus theoretical future sale of the building, and then discounts it back to current value. And then it says, basically, you need to hit this threshold, and then you kind of measure the threshold, measure the IRR return that you see against whatever your hurdle rate is. And usually your hurdle as a developer is, well, what can I make in an alternate project? What can I make in some other endeavor? And when we're doing a rental project, effectively, we have to look at what is the value at completion. So that's based on what rental rates are applied, how much it costs to operate the units, what's called the market capitalization rate is, which is the way we can put revenue stream into value.
Right.
Then we look at all the various and sundry costs of developing, hard costs, soft costs, financing fees, and those are broken out into many categories.
Right.
And then at the end of it, it's what does this thing look like, cash flowing over time. And then we can look at it based on, you know, how different types of finance. So how does the cash flow if we do traditional bank financing with 25-year amortization period at a higher interest rate? Or how does it pencil with CMHC, 50 years, lower rates?
Right.
And we usually see that the CMHC program right now makes a vast difference in terms of how these projects perform.
Right, so just maybe if I can just summarize and tell me if I'm missing anything, you know, there's the simplicity of this is like, you know, you basically look at cost and we look at.
That's
return,
basically
and we look at what it boils down to.
Yeah.
And then we're like, so the more nuance around this, we look at different financing mechanisms of, and then should we also just look at what the developers in the event require and let's see whether this pencils or not.
Effectively, yeah,
So-
and one of the things Joey's model here is what is the impact of that CMHC financing versus.
Right. So like if I'm understanding correctly, they're sort of recreating a pro forma like for like specific building types. And I just maybe to just make sure I understand it, like how confident are we on these pro formas? Like it's kind of like what I'm trying to understand is kind of like a sample pro forma, right? And you know the old joke, like the developer has two different pro formas, you know, but
One for the bank and one for you and one for the.
that's right.
Yeah.
And so like I'm just trying to understand, right? Like is that to what degree is there, what margin of error do we have here? Or what margin of certainty do we have here? Because like so maybe in a very simplistic way, what I would say is that, well, then if I just like made these assumptions, right, the numbers you're giving me, like I should be able to look at any building if I can figure out how much someone paid for the land and come up with their pro forma, right? And so I'm just trying to understand, given, you know, that old joke about 3D modeling, it's like how accurate are these calculations?
I'd say in general terms, what you say, like, could, you know, if I know what they pay for the land, I can go and recreate. Generally speaking, that's probably true within a certain margin, right? So I mean. We tend to veer towards the side of being as conservative as we can, try to
Right.
stress test the pro forma, so
Right.
that if we know costs range between X and Y, we'll put them more towards Y. If revenues are between, you know, this high and this low, we might
Right.
veer towards the middle or low, so we try to see like what sort of a medium to worst case scenario.
Right.
And in this exercise, the intent is not necessarily to perfectly calibrate like what is the return on
Right.
this project. It's more about understanding how these different incentive packages work in relation to one another. Or how big or small an impact they would be to the developers pro forma, not necessarily that this is perfectly calibrated to this exact project.
Oh, I guess one thing I'm quite curious about, maybe sort of build on that, so like you're saying, like, don't get stuck on the exact, is it 2.1 or 2.3,
Yeah,
like, just kind of like relative, like, and we're sort of, you're telling me they were probably pretty close, we're pretty, like, in that ballpark, like, close enough
I
for
would
this
say
general
so.
analysis. So maybe just to help me understand, like, the pre-zoning at 2.1%, I think I'm seeing there, like, it's not a huge number, like we said, but I'm just trying to like understand, like, just colloquially or anecdotally, you know, folks tell me, particularly non-market housing folks say, like, you know, as much time as you can save us, like
Yeah.
time, you know, timeline. What's my
Time, yeah.
like, oh, that kind of stuff, right? Like, so in my head, like pre-zoning would have, and that certainty that we talked about, right? That, so like in my head, pre-zoning was like, would be a fairly significant block, but right now I see it's only 2.1%.
So, and Joey, you can jump in if you want. So the pre-zoning piece. The way the pro forma captures the value of pre-zoning is primarily in, as you said, in timeline reduction.
Right.
Timeline reduction translates into the pro forma in terms of carrying costs on the land. So if you
Right.
finance your land purchase,
Right.
how much are you paying month over month as you wait for the process to unfold? So there are significant cost savings in that bucket. Overall, in the scheme of an entire project, that bucket is not a super significant piece in the entire scheme. But the other piece here that's not fully captured, right, is that pre-zoning is the impact on that gray line at the top, that fair viability kind of
Right.
margin. What a different version of it would probably show is that under the pre-zoning condition, that entire long triangle would move down.
Oh, like they would just require, right, what you were saying is like,
Because risk gets priced in, and as you remove risk,
right,
you end up with different finance or different return expectations.
right, so like, but I would just need less of a return in order to make that, so. Like, so what you was, I think what you were trying to say in the presentation, so like pre-zoning. Might actually have a larger impact on getting these things built than it might appear.
That's
in
exactly
the ground.
right.
Well, it's what you were saying with the binary, right? It's
Yes.
like, it
Well,
might be the
that's-
difference
yes.
between the go or no go for a
Right.
developer. Is
Right.
that level of certainty offered by pre-zoning
Right,
tips a smaller and medium scale developer into say taking something that's marginally viable under their risk profile.
Right.
Something that's more viable under the risk profile they're comfortable with.
Yeah, especially for that small scale builder who may
Right.
not even consider a project if they have to go through rezoning, because like,
Right.
we don't have the money to take this
Right.
risk on. But if it's already
Right.
saying, I can do this without
Right.
going through that process, then so in that case, it's sort of, it's a one or it's a zero, right?
right, okay, so like the comfort to smaller builders too, is something. to think
That's a
about.
huge one, I think.
So maybe just, thank you for that, and maybe just on another piece, like, I think I just wanna make sure I understand, like, you know, like, if you could just walk me through sort of a more elementary level, the sort of financial, like, the sort of market conditions for development now, because what I'm generally hearing is that it's, market conditions are quite bad now, like, and you gotta, like, you put whatever levers you gotta put in, but you gotta put some levers in if you want kind of housing you want, and just to make sure I understand, like, and the market conditions are so bad because construction costs are high, land costs are high, interest costs, like interest carrying costs are high, like what else we got here?
That's on the cost side, and then because interest costs are where they are, it translates on the buyer or the renter side to the general, well, especially on the buyer side, they can't qualify for the same amount of mortgage as they would before.
And we were hearing from some developers in Maple Ridge, the need to like shrink the average unit size because the buyers can effectively afford less
Right.
on a unit basis. And
Right.
so that has impact on the revenue.
Now, I mean, on the positive side, the kind of astronomical, like upward hockey stick shape of the hard costs that we've seen over the last few years have
Right.
started to kind of taper off.
Okay,
So we hope that that's gonna go back to a more normal pace of increase.
And we're seeing
the
pressure off the interest rate, the first cut this
So-
past week or last week.
So that gives some signals to the market that maybe things are gonna be a little more predictable at least.
right,
Yeah.
Like, can you help me understand whether I'm getting this right? If we wanted to make sort of like very, very large, significant changes in order to make like projects more viable, like, is it like really the big three, like touch land, land costs, or construction costs, or interest rates, many of which like municipal government doesn't have control over, but just to make sure I understand, like, and then this kind of stuff is wonderful, but it almost seems to me it's kind of like a little bit at the margins, well, like the three, like, is that an accurate way of thinking about it?
I would say, I wouldn't say it's inaccurate, but what it also signals again is really important to the funders, right? To the CMHCs and the BC Housings. If there are incentives in place, it shows a reduced risk profile for a project. It shows municipal willingness to support this type of housing, which is not always the case.
Right.
And that can make a big difference in the internal kind of schemings of CMHC and BC Housing to what they see, right? Like whereas if they're comparing a highly incentivized project in a municipality that's supportive of a certain type of development.
Right.
And they're weighing that against the municipality that's uncertain or doesn't have a lot of written explicit policies in place, they're gonna lean towards the more certainty and the higher incentive.
The more
project.
favorable.
Yeah.
Okay.
I also think that's where like that nonprofit scenario steps in, where your question about rezoning and how that affects viability. It might be that some funders look very favorably on a municipality having pre-zoned a certain development application, and then it weighs more competitive.
Particularly if it can bring down those operating costs, right? Because that's one thing, BC Housing, for a long time, they steered away from any projects that had operating costs. We've seen them return to a willingness to invest in having kind of longer term operating subsidies under the community housing fund. But anything that can be done to bring those down and make the project more independently viable, they're seeing positively as well.
Thank you. I think my two last questions on this is one, like, so on a separate note, like, you talked about how like 0 to 6 stories was viable, 6 to 18-ish stories not viable, and 18 up is viable. Can you explain to me why there's that deficit, like what's going on between 6 to 18?
Yeah, generally it's just all about, because past 6, you're switching construction materials to concrete.
Yeah.
You kind of have to, based on current market economics, how much the cost premium is on concrete versus how much additional revenue you might be able to charge for that type of product.
Right.
You really have to push the density quite high before those two numbers rebalance. So right now, most developers in many communities are saying that 6 to 18 is like the complete dead zone where nothing pencils, and then past 18, in some cases, things do start to pencil.
Okay.
And this is not a Maple Ridge unique situation. We hear this everywhere, and if you do see 8 to 12-story concrete, it's usually more of a luxury product in markets. Like you do see some of that product being built in Vancouver, Burnaby, Richmond, but prices are quite high.
So maybe thank you for that. And then I think my last around this is the last time you came in here, Matt, I think with another colleague as well, I'm just looking at your previous presentation, there were under 2 things, potential directions for the strategy, and like under big moves, we talked about things like strengthen perimeter protections, address various development, which is kind of here, promote equity and inclusion, undertake a municipal land strategy, housing authority, those pieces, like where do they fall in our framework of our discussion?
Yeah, I mean, some of the bigger ticket items like exploring the feasibility of a municipal housing authority, those are sort of bigger items that we're, pointing staff towards that would be for future consideration. The land strategy is probably the one that feeds into the non-market or nonprofit units most strongly, and I'd sort of touched on that earlier, where a lot of municipalities are starting to look not only at their own land base, but at partnerships and sort of essentially empowering staff to start convening partnerships with potential landholders in a community. So I think that piece is aligning with what the analysis is showing around the impact of a land contribution in combination with BC Housing funding for non-market housing, for example. And that might then further align with the sort of, if there's a DCC waiver, it's coming in on that kind of project, which is heavily skewed towards non-market or deep subsidy type of units.
So just to make sure I understand, between consultants and staff, like where these pieces that we talked about in the last workshop, like when does that come into the discussion? Like in today's discussion, we talked about some very specific levers, but then the rest of the stuff, like when to discuss those?
So This element is very specific under what will likely be a handful of actions identified under the housing strategy. So I don't have the other presentation, but essentially there is 5 general areas, and then under each one of them will have specific actions. And then council will be able to say, yes, do this, don't do that, depending on your thoughts on the overall strategy. So essentially, the strategy is going to bring down a roadmap, and then that will set off staff to start implementing each one of those actions. So based on this conversation, we can say, you know, pre-zoning, we've heard council comments on pre-zoning, so most likely that housing strategy is going to have a bit that will focus on that. It's also going to break out those other headings that we're not focusing on today. So like we're only looking at a tiny little bit of the pie. The entire picture will come back for you. I believe, as we mentioned, we are waiting for the provincial government to provide that next piece. So the timeline on when that will be, we don't know yet. I would prepare yourselves for a conversation in the fall, unless that information comes out this week. And we'll make sure to have that opportunity for you to kind of go through that housing strategy and discuss and debate what those actions look like.
And what that next iteration of the housing strategy will look like, it will have a bit of an implementation plan to it. So you'll see sort of timelines and associated resources with each of the actions as to when, you know, we've discussed with staff, and then council can provide final comments on it. So
That's perfect, thank you. And I just wanted to ask to make sure that those other pieces probably require discussion too, then just wanted to make sure that we don't stand in afraid. Cool. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. Last thing before I end this section here. One, I'll say I'm not necessarily a fan of waiving DCCs. I think we have too much work that needs to get done. But I'm more concerned with potential unintended consequences. And it might, because of now we've gone from first to first and second, maybe that resolved the issue, but are we increasing the value of a property because we're giving certain, we're waiving certain things here? It's the developer that needs to build. Would there be an incentive to not build and then turn and flip? And therefore taking a lot longer to actually get it built. So great, I've got all this that you're giving me. The idea is now go out and get it done. But if that developer then turns around and says, oh, I can get out fast here by just selling the whole thing to somebody else, make some extra money, and then I'm out, and then let somebody else worry about it. Are we transferring the same agreement to that new party? You know, so I worry that we're not creating a new industry segment of flipping property because they've got more value, if that makes sense.
So there are elements to it. So under the pre-zoning, it's an excellent example where if we were to pre-zone and it is just a regular single family home, they would now see mill rates at the apartment level, right? So that could incentivize someone to sell that may not have wanted to sell to another buyer. So presumably another single family homeowner wouldn't necessarily want to take on that. So it may go to a developer, a speculator, a builder, the range of gamut. What we can't necessarily guarantee is that it's going to go to someone who's going to walk in the door with an application within 3-6 months. There's money to be made in holding and flipping properties, and that is something that could occur. I would say we would need to look, and I don't even know if we can fully answer that question under the scope of this piece of work about what other tools or techniques could help limit the risk of flipping, and then it's a trade-off conversation there as well, right? So when we are having that specific pre-zoning conversation, like there would be a very detailed trade-off conversation about which areas in the community you would be interested in doing this, because there are risks associated and there's trade-offs with that. So council would need to be comfortable with that risk to a certain extent in order to implement that tool. Some of the other ones may not have such a high risk to those that either live in the property today or may be interested in purchasing the property in the near future. And maybe we can kind of reframe that a little bit in the write-up in the report or something.
Okay, thank you. I think it's important that we take that into consideration ultimately. And when we're talking about all this legislation, everybody's talking about the same thing, but nobody's talking about the actual developer because he'll develop when they want to develop, right? Based on market conditions. So I'm cautious. I don't want to create a whole new thing here. Councilor Carreras.
Just one last question, because you brought up the mill rate and the pre-zoning. Can you just talk about, so if we pre-zone an area that, you know, when we start looking at the Logie corridor and things like that, a lot of it is single family homes. If we pre-zone it, what happens to the current taxes? If someone's in a single family home and they're staying there.
So my understanding is if we can change a land use designation, so the Logan area transit corridor piece is changing the land use.
Yeah,
We still
it's the
charge,
OVP part.
correct,
Yeah.
we still charge at the zone. So there is certainly a reason, it is one of the stronger reasons why we haven't necessarily entertained significant amounts of pre-zoning, because that will start to change.
Because if we pre-zone it,
conversation.
that's what changes it. So how does that impact? So single family home, Logie corridor, again, not OCP changes, we're talking about like rezoning. And we pre-zone it for this, you know, 20-story apartment, and they're not ready to sell, they like living there. What happens to their taxes?
I would perhaps suggest that we wouldn't necessarily pre-zone until you have a developer or builder at the table.
Okay.
Because the city could move forward a pre-zoning process fairly quickly. That isn't necessarily tied to the same level of detail that a development application would require under a traditional rezoning process. One of the outcomes of this would be to essentially flesh out what pre-zoning would look like relative to the system that you see today. It is that like we can't pre-zone anything without council's approval, so we would have all of that outlined for you, because that is essentially the crux of the conversation.
So we look at pre-zoning as being one of those levers to increase the viability of a project. But you're saying we don't want to pre-zone it until we have a project because there's a
It's that
significant
negotiation.
impact on who's living
We're
there
willing to
currently.
pre-zone it for you if you do X, Y, and Z, or if you bring this in. I don't think we would do it well in advance of someone being at the table because of those unintended consequences.
Just want to be clear on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Duick, Councilor Youssef, then Councilor Schiller.
Thank you for raising that, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the answers, because that was kind of my concern too, and so I like the signal it, and then we could put some agreement in place which would address your concerns, and the main thing for me is, as Councilor Kerr said, if somebody's in a single family home isn't ready to, and we pre-zone it, and now they're taxed, we've heard this, I think it was in Vancouver where that happened. And then that's not the intent here, and I mean, if there is an area where we really feel strong, then the opposite side of it is if the mill rate goes up, there'll be an incentive for somebody to develop it. So, you know, I can see it on both sides, but I would not want to do it to an area where it's primarily single family, that people aren't ready yet to leave those single family homes. But I like so we got some work to do on it. So signaling it is probably a great way to deal with that, because then it takes care of all aspects of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Youssef.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I would look to staff to correct me if I'm wrong on the fact that the tax implications are based on the actual use of the property. So just because we may, as council, pre-zone a certain area, or as the previous speakers have alluded to, signaling that this is where this neighborhood is going to go and the direction that we'd like to see it develop into. Just by doing that, wouldn't necessarily have the significant tax implications immediately. Rather, it is when the property is developed, then that's when the tax would increase. I look to staff for clarity on that.
I believe you are correct on that. I would want to have a conversation with DC Assessment just to make sure that my understanding aligns with yours.
Thank you. I'm on that page as well. So thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilor Schiller.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I'm definitely appreciative of this approach where we sort of tie our incentives to the incentives that other people bring to the table. And I did just want to take this opportunity to say I am very much in favor of the parking reductions. To me, that seems like the most straightforward and sort of the biggest bang for the buck option in front of us, and I think it's something we need to lead to. Thanks.
Thank you, and back to Delegate Tan.
Thanks, Mayor. Just a bit on that free zoning conversation, I'm curious like about maybe the staff and the consultants about capturing your land. Because I remember the Vancouver issues too, but I don't know whether it was specifically pre-zoning or I remember that Cambie corridor where like just even like council signaling that they were happy with high rises, right? I don't even know if there was a pre-zoning, but like immediately like the land value went up. So like I'm just trying to figure out like a way to if pre-zoning is gonna reduce the viability threshold, particularly for no-market housing, like let's look at that, but like how do we then capture land? Do we pre-zone for specific, like specific only for like no-market housing? Do we pre-zone and put in land like capture mechanisms? Like what's the advice here?
Yeah, that's a very good question and complicated question, and I think there would have to be some more exploration of what the right mechanisms to put in place are to try and either quell speculation or capture lift. So in the Cambie corridor example, you're right, even the signaling of the Cambie corridor plan
Right.
led to massive speculation on there were single family lots trading for upwards of $7 million
Wow.
apiece. The issue there was that at the time of the initial layout of that plan, the city hadn't fully thought through how to do the value capture. And in that case, they didn't pre-zone. Every single lot that's developed on Cambie is like a CD zone. It was every one of them went through the rezoning process.
Wow.
And what the city realized though, by not putting in place preset target CMC rates at the get-go, they kind of let a lot of that lift get captured by the vendors.
Right.
They sort of, down the road, they kind of, partially put the cat back in the bag through the implementation of target CAC rates and signaling to the market that, you're gonna go through a rezoning, this is what you're gonna pay to go through it.
Right.
And they've learned some lessons there and they've implemented it since on the Broadway corridor, or they're doing it in the Redford area. But in that case, yeah, there was no pre-zoning. So here, the pre-zoning, we'd have to think through what the implications are, because ultimately the value of a site is a function of what you're allowed to build on it. It's always a calculation of what you can get for it, what the revenue is minus the cost minus the profit equals the land value.
Right, so there's the speculation issue and the property tax issue.
Those are
So
two,
those-
yes, exactly.
Right, and so it does sound like there are mechanisms to deal with it, we should talk about it more, but we should look at.
There are mechanisms and
Right.
it's a conversation that's
Right.
ongoing in many municipalities, but it's a great question.
But generally speaking, I think from a macroeconomic perspective, and Justin, you could jump in here if I'm misstating anything. When we think about pre-zoning and the examples of pre-zoning that we've seen in sort of Western North America,
Right.
the more broadly you do it, the less land speculation is associated with it. So what we've seen through the Bill 44 changes, it's happened across all the metro areas.
Right.
And so we're not seeing the same level of speculation as Kelowna saw on its downtown core when they introduced higher density on single family lots around the downtown core, where all of a sudden property prices did jump up. And that mirrors the experience of Oregon when they did density on single family. So I think if we wanted to make and this is a large generalization, probably lots of caveats associated, but the more broadly you pre-zone, the less likely you are to see site-to-site speculation, but you might see sort of a softer land lift over a wider
I
area.
think that's fair, because the other version where you're just releasing density in little bits and spurts, they become release valves for pent-up demand if the prices go up, but if you do it more broadly. Theoretically, you're kind of bottleneck.
Thank you for that. I think that's a good starting conversation. I've been interested, like for staff, I'd be interested when that zoning conversation comes back to us, like having a more fulsome conversation about mechanisms around that capture and property taxes. That would be quite helpful. On two other topics. One, I'm just curious for maybe for specific, maybe a staff question for which areas of our downtown and stuff like Western Maple Ridge, Low LT Camp area do we know that like the geographically we can support the 20 stories? I'm not talking about FRE, I'm talking more about like the play situation. Can we even like, can we even like, is this a thing for community?
I mean, on the one hand, I think the answer is with time and money, anything's possible.
Right.
But if you're asking if it's viable in the next 6 months, I don't know if we really tested it everywhere. at the moment, we entertain it on a case by case basis for every development application. So in order, like. You see the geotech reports, right? So you get that level of certainty that it is certainly constructible based on the policies and bylaws in place at that time. So I could be wrong, but I don't know if anyone's really dug lower than 2 stories right now, so.
Right, so maybe like, I guess like, Councilor Dewitt's been here longer, she probably no longer, no more, but just kind of looking for like a rough rule of thumb around like. This general area, like 20 stories is probably not viable, you know, or this general area, like.
The challenge with that question, Councilor Tan, is that this corporation doesn't have all the soil samples for every square footage of piece. So
Sure,
it's
yeah,
based on
sure.
a context discussion. So on a case by case basis, we
Yeah.
know that there's areas, the FRA is an example,
Right.
which is an area that we're still studying.
Sure.
We know in the
Yeah.
downtown core, there's soils that are probably more acceptable to higher density and higher high rises, and that would be done on a case by case basis. When the developer comes in to trigger whether or not we want to be able to do that. The purpose of our area plans is to ensure that you're controlling the density in areas that you want to intensify. So that we can make sure you got proper infrastructure. Council's direction so far has been focus on on the Logie Highway.
Yeah.
Because that's what BRT is going, look at how you can intensify the density. As members. Another area of focus is on the downtown core.
Right.
And that is the work that planning and engineering are working on in those 2 key areas.
Right, we can signal where we want to go, but we don't have soil samples for every area, so there's kind of like, there's a bit of a black hole here in terms of knowledge, I understand. Okay, thank you for that. I guess my last question, or my last thought is around the parking issue. I'm curious, we looked at 1.7 to 1.2, and then for non-market, we look at 1.7 to 1.05. Like, how were those, like, how was the 1.2 and the 1.05 chosen? Like, did we test going down more, like what those cost implications of each? I'm just kind of looking for a few different options here.
Yeah, so the 1.7 to the 1.2, that's just a straight 30% reduction based on current parking requirements. We've spoken to like a few developers on like, you know, how much parking is really like in excess, and it seems like there could be a few based on current requirements, but it really is like most people do own a car or 2 in each household, and so anything above like 1 is still required right now. The 1.7 to 1.05, that was for the non-market rental requirement. It's based on like an average blend of like if we had certain like 1 stall for 1 bedroom and 2 stalls for like a 3+. It's a blend of those ones. And generally with non-market rental units, they would be smaller units because of the demographics as well. And then as an illustrative example for like the TOA areas at 0 parking, that's where we decide to just test that and to see what the impact on viability is.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think like that makes sense. Like just all talking to developers, kind of getting a sense of how many cars per household. I think the reason why I ask is just wanting to make sure that when we do have those parking conversations, like we do have a few options just so that we can, you know, option A, option B, option C, like, and like, I wonder if we can tie that to, I know TransLink did that study of parking availability in the Metro Vancouver area, and then they looked at Maple Ridge, like, I wonder if there was like, I was going to be curious if that was tied, like this option was tied because like Maple Ridge, you know, in these areas, parking utilization is only this much, like, so I just, it's like, you know, I understand the straight 30% like sort of reduction, but I just kind of, I wonder if I'm kind of looking for a little bit more sort of like precision around that, you know. Yeah, it's just to put that out for different more options to discuss. Is there a way where we can get sort of more options on the table that we can look at?
So I think that conversation is tied more to the conversation around the parking bylaw as opposed to the housing strategy and incentive. So we can take that away, but I think that's a separate conversation and a separate project group that will be able to like provide. Because I think at that higher level, this is that view to say these incentives produce this order of magnitude. The details beyond that would need to be implemented through a city policy or bylaw, and that's the implementation tool of that is our parking bylaw. So we can certainly take those comments and probably have a bit of a conversation, but you would see the implementation of it through that bylaw as opposed to when this comes back as a housing strategy.
And then if it is more data that supports a certain level of parking reduction, that can be fed back to us. We can rerun the numbers to see based on that. But this is, I think, probably this is illustrative, but I think it kind of sort of just tells the story of your magnitude of cost savings of parking in general.
Right, I appreciate it. I think like, yes, appreciate it. I think it comes back to the parking bylaw, and also I think it comes back to housing strategy too, because it does touch. And the point of it is for housing affordability, so you know, I wouldn't want it necessarily isolated in the Austrian parking bylaw. I think that's technically where it belongs, but contextually, it's like the point of us doing this for housing affordability. So I would have been interested, to have just see more options, like come through the economic analysis. Like if that's a possibility for a future draft, I would love to see that. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much. At this point, I want to thank you for being here today and presenting to us. I do need a motion to receive this item. Moved by Councillor Schiller, seconded by Councillor Carreras. Any more final comments? All those in favor? Motion is carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Thank you once again for your hard work and your efforts. And looking forward to the next thing that comes to us with that. Okay, we are now going to go to item 5.2. And just a heads up, we do have lunch coming in at 1. I have to feed those mites. Yeah, let's take a 5-minute recess.
Presenter.
Say this is your page too.
Yeah.
Aye.
Yep, they could go.
Okay, thank you, everybody. The time is 12:18. We will reconvene. And move to item 5.2, Northeast Albion Land Use and Servicing Review, Engagement Options and Next Steps. You're back.
Different side of the table.
You have the floor.
All right. So this item is a continuation of the conversation we've been having about the future of a portion of Northeast Albion. So this general area is at the outer limits of our growth area, if you will, to our east. So the diagonal line is the urban containment boundary and the urban growth bank boundary, as identified by both the city and Metro Vancouver. So the conversation for today is really going to be focused within that red line. Taking a step back for a moment, this conversation was last before you in October last year, where staff came down with a scoping report identifying that some conditions had changed within the community as well as the larger economic landscape, and that it was worth taking a closer look at the red bounded area for what we might be able to do within this area. So since October, we've been doing a bit of a targeted land use and servicing review of how this area could develop and be serviced. As a part of this process, we did go out to the community in February, which we'll delve into in just a second, but this is very much a continuation of our conversation from previous year. So very briefly about what that public consultation looks like. Our standard city process, we had a webpage, there was a bit of social media to support and highlight the conversations that we were having with the community. We, of course, sent out some letters to the residents that were nearby, both within the study area and adjacent to. We had an open house on February 22nd, as well as a survey that kicked off on the 22nd and ran into March. So we'll go through what we heard through the public engagement process in just a moment, but before we do, I think it's worth just taking a moment to highlight the land uses currently within the study area, as well as the options that went to the community. So on the left-hand side is a snapshot of what land uses are in effect today. So west of 248, or the left-hand side of the screen, is your single family interspersed with their natural features. So the green areas are generally your recommended setbacks from the creeks in the area. And then in the middle portion, we have the designation that really spoke to ground-oriented multifamily. So this would have been your duplex, triplex, fourplex. Again, this designation came pre-Bill 44, comes from a conversation that we had in the community in 2019. And in this middle area, there was also the possibility for a commercial node. The policies in place today are a bit vague on what this could look like. It was very much going to be whatever the market could support when development was ready to come into this area. So it could be a relatively small commercial node, or it could maybe have multiple stories, but we'll get into that in just a moment. And then on the right-hand side of the map, or east of 249th Street, the designation is very much single family. That land use designation was originally identified to reflect that boundary to the urban growth area. So it was intended to have, at the time, slightly larger lots in order to kind of transition nicely to the homes that were being built outside of our growth area. So the next two slides are going to go through the two concepts that were presented for community comment. Not necessarily the most exciting names, but concept 1 and concept 2. So for the first concept, we were looking at incremental growth in the area. So this is still keeping that single family against that edge, and that's an element that's consistent within both concepts. The focus for both of these was really on what the possibilities were for the middle section and then the left-hand section. So for concept 1, it was looking at what it could be, or how the service implications would be if we move these to townhome forms. And then for the second concept, we were looking at a little bit higher density. So this is really challenging what has been seen in this area to date. But we had heard from the community as well as council that they were open to a range of options, so we thought we'd bring this to the community. Consistent with all of the concepts is of course the co-located park and school just to the south, so that's not being included as part of the study area and remains a constant. So what we generally heard is that for that portion west of 248th Street, so between concept 1 and concept 2, it was the townhouse designation. So there was general support for being able to increase this land use to a townhouse residential form. In the middle, there is a bit of support for the higher density in terms of in terms of apartments. There's more consensus on the townhouse form. But there's one of the things that we're generally hearing is that people were open to seeing more housing than what was currently being experienced in this area. And then for the portion that is east of 249th, or that portion against the growth boundary, that you can kind of see neutral to support with the single family designation. So we did receive some comments that they would be open to higher levels of density, but it wasn't as strong as with some of the other ones. So in general, what this kind of comes down to in terms of themes is that people are aware that we need more homes. And ideally, we need these homes to be, for lack of a better word, affordable. What that means, we're not necessarily speaking to affordable housing as defined by the province, but something that we can see families or individuals moving into and building out our community. There is also general interest to maintain and explore the viability of what that commercial node could be. It would be the second one in the area, bringing this general Northeast Albion area to frankly being as close to a complete community as we have in the area for something that's not in a town center in a really high density area. On the flip side, we certainly did hear about some concerns about traffic and parking, particularly if we were to increase the density in this area. One of the elements that we were certainly looking at townhomes is that housing form does come with a parking, visitor parking requirement that you don't generally see in your traditional single family neighborhoods. And one of the other themes that we really heard was just like, as soon as possible, again, speaking to that pressure on housing and affordability that we hear from various avenues throughout our experiences with the city. So it was a good conversation with council or our community. It was good turnout. So I think it was really, having been at the open house in 2019 to the conversations in 2024, it was a nice evolution of how the community had shifted. So we were happy with the turnout as well as what was heard. The other element, though, in terms of how we were going to move forward is that technical servicing review. So we essentially reaffirmed, we've had a fair amount of development in the area, so we're still quite comfortable with having the environmental features being that base of what this plan can be. So you'll see on the left-hand side is just the environmental features. This is reflective of the steep streams and steep slopes that we have in the area, as well as a high-level review of what the mobility and transportation networks look like within the plan itself. So the study area has very few roads today. Most of the future roads would be internal to the development. So generally speaking, we could reaffirm that the concept aligned with what had been done in 2019 and endorsed by council in 2022. The more challenging element of this review was really what would density do to our water and sanitary servicing components. So the work that was done in 2019 did include a fairly detailed servicing analysis. And at that time, the densities that were brought forward under the concept plan did reflect the capacity that we had in the system at that point in time and that we could reasonably forecast over the short term. So a couple of years later that it tests out again. So it is showing that if we were to further densify within this area, it changes the conversation about that infrastructure requirement in this area for both water and sewage, or sewer, sorry. If we go above the current land uses, it's going to require upgrades. We have been able to do an initial look at what this could look like. So the numbers that are included in the report and on the screen are Class D estimates. They are reflective of current projects that either recently completed within the city and adjusted for inflation to 2024 to 2026 dollars, because of course, by the time it's constructed, it would be 2026. So it gives you a rough idea of the level of infrastructure that would be required in order to service the higher densities in this area. These costs are not currently included in our development cost charges bylaw. They are eligible for rebate if someone was to upfront some of the costs. So there's a little bit of nuance there in terms of what the financing could look like, but it is really just to highlight that we need infrastructure to bring more people into this area. And there, just as a note, there is already a latecomer in place for all of the units within Northeast Albion to facilitate the pump station that was just recently constructed on 112. So the outcomes of this conversation did result in a revised land use plan being put forward, or a land use concept, I should say, from staff's work. So this, what's on the screen before you, you'll see retains that single family component on the left-hand side, a small adjustment to townhome in the center, and then maintains that single family component on the right-hand side. One of the reasons that we were able to look at townhomes in that center piece is due to an interesting quirk of density, if you will. The townhome density is equivalent to what the ground-oriented density zone would require. So it's a horizontal transfer. So we're not actually increasing the density by being able to make this shift, but we're opening up some flexibility in terms of the housing forms that we could see in the area. And townhomes are certainly a housing form that the group, the developers and builders are comfortable constructing. So that was one of the reasons why we were able to support that land use designation change. But in order to increase it beyond that, whether it be apartments in the center or townhomes on the left-hand side, we will need to have that infrastructure conversation in tandem with it. So the reason we are here today is essentially for council direction on how you would like to move forward. So the recommendation in the report is that should the concept 3 or the hybrid concept be of interest to you, we are able to move forward an OCP amending bylaw that would make that change to the Northeast Albion land use concept. Alternatively, there is the option to continue with the existing land uses in place or take a closer look in particular areas subject to council direction. And with that, I'll open the floor to questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I suspect that probably need a little bit more information on this. But I will open it up for questions, and I see Councillor Youssef. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to staff for the report and presentation. I'm real curious about the concept 3. Is this is what was done in-house after the public engagement had concluded? Is that correct?
That's correct. So you went to the public while the in-house review was taking place, so that they were done concurrently in order to meet the requested timelines.
Right, and this was only done in-house. There is no outside consultant or anyone else that's seen concept 3 until this report, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, well, I do take issue with that, as we proposed one of 2 options to the public and to people that would be interested in this area, and now we're coming up with our own concept that really, if I may, through you, Mr. Chair, misses the mark for me. With the concept 2 is the one that I would have been more in favor of, because of course, as we've heard from the public, there is a desperate need for more housing coming online quicker. The townhouse, to look at the map and look at the surrounding area and being familiar with the general neighborhood and that portion of Albion, to continue with townhouses west of 248 would actually fit in better with the rest of what's been done to the south and to the west of that, again, as part of where Albion has been growing. For the low-rise apartments, yeah, I can't see low-rise apartments going in there. That would be a step too far. So let's keep it to townhouses, just so we're clear on that. And of course, moving forward with the townhouse form of housing, I like the fact that while we heard concerns of traffic and parking, to ease those concerns, townhouses tend to have the visitor parking to be able to mitigate those issues that may arise from it. To the servicing, as was mentioned with the sewer and water, again, I go back to our previous discussion where I thought it was clear that the DCCs collected from the units that are to be developed are then what's going to carry the costs of capital projects and infrastructure expansion and pay for the infrastructure that's needed to then be able to provide the housing. And outside of a complete engineering assessment, really, we're all just kind of spitballing it here rather than speaking on solid ground or speaking from a place where we have the actual data and we have the proper assessment done by the engineering department or external consultants that then would be able to tell us where we stand on the infrastructure bit. And lastly, Mr. Chair, I'd like to hear from staff about how, again, going back to Bill 44 and the density that may come of it, if we're going with, as is being proposed, the single family zoning for the west of 248th, where that density may be, because then we're opening up to the ability of people to be able to put up to a fourplex on each one of these properties. And would that not also trigger the servicing upgrades that are needed? But in this case, we wouldn't be able to capture the revenues of the DCCs. So I'd like clarity from staff on that through you, Mr. Chair.
Chair Hartman.
So let me remind council where we are in a process. We have done a northeast area plan. We've gone through public engagement, open house. You've received feedback that a large majority of residents attending that open house look to see some type of higher density in that area. You've got two options in front of you with a third option, which is a hybrid. Part of that is because staff are concerned about the cost of the utility and the infrastructure. The fact that you've got bills now coming forward from the province in an area where you can intensify your density around townhouses, Albion is right for that area, if that is the wish and direction of council. Staff have gotten together yesterday and over the weekend and come up with an alternate recommendation, because in order for us to fully explore the costs to the municipality and cost of potential developers in this area, we need to do some more estimations on tightening up what those infrastructure challenges are going to be going into this area because of stuff that is downstream. And so as staff have identified, we've got some Class D estimates at $30 million. In order for council to really make an informed decision, it's prudent for us to go back and do a little more detailed analysis on the construction estimates, including the cost of land and the infrastructure required, so that we can better inform our DCC bylaw conversation that is going to be coming forward in the next couple of weeks. And that's important for us to have a line of sight on what the costs are going to be to light up this area of Albion to do the right thing. And what we've seen is the densification of townhouses makes sense in the Albion area. We need a bit more diligence to be able to ensure that we have that information for potential developers as well as for council, so that we're going in with eyes wide open. And so if it's council's wish, staff have an alternate recommendation from it, which is that we go back and do a bit more studying, do some peer reviews of the existing environmental and infrastructure requirements that are sitting there, so that we can bring further data back so you can make an informed decision about densification. You're not being triggered today to make a decision on, do you want single family or do you want townhouses? What we're looking for is a toe test and workshop of what do you envision from an area plan in this area? Do you envision townhouses? Do you envision row houses and duplexes? Because that informs the modeling that we need to be able to do. The default from staff sent on the recommendation you report is because staff were concerned about the cost of infrastructure. But given the fact that you've got one chance to do this right, if it's council's wish, we'll go back and study the infrastructure requirement in a little more detail bring some more information back to council, reach out to other developers that are in that area to make sure we have a number that we can all live with. So that we're all going in with eyes wide open. And Councillor Youssef, to your point, ensuring that the costs that we're putting in for infrastructure align with our DCC bylaw that you haven't not yet seen. That's coming forward the next couple of weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman. That actually, that solidifies where I will stand on this, that I will go for the alternate recommendation, as without having the DCC bylaw before us, it seems to me that we're putting the cart before the horse, and I would definitely be more in favor of a more detailed analysis to truly look at where we can get that density in the forms of townhouses. So thank you for that. That clarifies it, and I won't drone on. Those are my comments and questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And again, thank you to staff for the work they've done thus far.
Thank you, Councillor Duick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Hartman, for signaling the alternate recommendation. So for me, I've learned a couple of lessons through this process, and one of them is we should have actually had this conversation before we went out for reviewing the Albion, Northeast Albion, because we presented to the public concept 1, concept 2. We should have known this was a challenge in that area, so I think we heard loud and clear that townhouses is what the feedback was received. It's where the direction that I was looking for when we were looking to update the Albion area plan. Otherwise, why would we go through a 7-8 months process to come up with the same densification other than a small piece on the west, or the east of 248. East of 249, remaining single family makes total sense. All along, I thought it should be single family because it's abutting the more rural aspect of it, so I can support that. I think we do need to have the information on what's required from an infrastructure for sure. Having said that, if we didn't do that and we just remained the same, then we would be facing this, as Councillor Youssef said, infrastructure challenges through Bill 44. I think of what we're hearing, families, they are struggling to purchase single family homes. It's not that it's necessarily their choice, it's a reality of today's economic times. And when we started this process in October, one of the reasons we looked at reviewing this area was the global and local economy. We were hearing that townhouses, multifamily is which is the market is bearing. So for that reason, the work was good for that reason. It confirmed what we thought was necessary. So the missing piece is, how is it funded? Who paid for it, and all of that. So my support is the original concept 1 based on the alternate recommendation. And I think the parking issue in that, to me, as long as the townhouse is designed in a manner that has sufficient garages and has driveway space out front, the parking issues aren't an issue. I recently toured a townhouse unit. There was tons of parking. The garages were huge. So it can be done. We can insist on having parking within each unit and stuff. So thank you.
Councillor Carreras.
Thank you. Well, I just got back from 5 days in Calgary, where we saw firsthand the importance of infrastructure, where they had a major water pipe burst the first day and everybody got put on absolute lockdown with water. We couldn't shower with, sink bathing, and restaurants had to use plastic cups because they couldn't wash their dishes. It was a really serious issue in a major city. So it really did remind all of us, and there were 3,100 of us local politicians gathered, about the importance of infrastructure. And I think that's a real concern for this region. I'll be honest, I've never been a fan of this. To me, this feels very much like urban sprawl. It is what it is. It's gone through. It's just not my favorite. I would much rather concentrate my densification along the corridors or even off 240th, where
there's at least some transit routes and some straightforward streets. I think we do need to go back and take a look at this a little bit more because the infrastructure is significant. And so when I look at this list here, the total of $30,000, is that sort of the estimated cost it would be per unit to recruit the infrastructure build out?
30 million?
The 30 million, but then there's this 30,000, like the approximate cost.
So the table you're looking at is the high level breakdown of what each infrastructure type has been estimated at the Class D level to cost. Later on in the report, there's a brief section that breaks it out by unit. And that is to illustrate that should the infrastructure cost be put in the DCC bylaw, it would break down through the traditional DCC bylaw approach. If we needed to construct this infrastructure in advance of the DCCP, there would be a way to upfront the cost by someone, a group of developers or what have you. And then if that was the case, what that would look like in order to cost share it throughout the impacted area. So that's why you have two different numbers because it was run under both concept 1 and concept 2.
Okay, so I see the 30 million, which is
I think it's
what was originally envisioned.
Yeah, it should be roughly 65,000 and 100,000 depending on the concept.
Okay, all right, I remember seeing that in here too. It's probably circled somewhere in this massive. So that's the 65,000, 100,000 is what we would have to ask per unit.
It is what it would need to be. So the unit itself wouldn't be providing that cost, it'd be the developer providing that cost to the city. It's an additional cost that they would have to build into their pro forma in order to test out if it works or not. And at those levels, it is starting to put.
So we're not building attainable housing anyhow. It could be a townhouse, because it's maybe so much higher than anywhere else in the city because of the infrastructure build. Okay, because that's a significant amount to add on to it. So they can build a townhouse, but down the street at 240th and 104 would be a significantly lower cost. I do want to just explore the Bill 44, because this has just been a big piece for our community and many other communities, is we struggle with these questions, right? Like, what does this mean? And I know we control minimum lot size, and then what happens to that lot size is really under the provincial legislation. So if we're doing single family lots there, technically they could build a 3 or a 4-plex on there. I think our minimum lot size would make it, like, I know they're not all going to do it. I also recognize that Langley Township and Maple Ridge are still selling single family homes higher than anywhere else in Metro Vancouver. But as we move forward, it's less likely they'll be building single family homes. So even if we do have single family homes there and they start building, 3 and 4-plexes, there will be a minimum of 2 units on each lot with basement space. Do we even have the infrastructure to sustain that?
So the Bill 44 part is always a challenge, and there's a little bit of a crystal ball component to this. So we're still figuring out what it looks like. To your point, it is generally assumed that in the short term, we will still continue to construct and build single family product. This may include a secondary suite, and this may include a detached garden suite, depending where they are in the area. When we did these initial concepts, we didn't have the minimum lot size for Bill 44 sorted. So we were running under the single family, like your traditional single family developments. We have a rough idea of what the unit count will switch to, or at least the lot count will switch to under Bill 44. And given the topography and the road requirement, because it shifts a little bit when it's single family versus the strata development under townhouse, the order of magnitude shift isn't as significant as we originally thought. So we have some level of comfort that if it was to move forward under the original recommendation today, that there would be an increase in density within that margin of error that we could support. Now, we haven't run the full Bill 44 analysis on all areas. I believe it's underway and we have some initial results. So of course, more information would always be better and we'd be able to support that. But this isn't the area where it's necessarily going to be the tipping point. Bill 44 in and of itself.
Okay, I think it's interesting, like, these are the things that, the information that we'll need when we start talking to our MLAs about the challenges, and I think this is why we've asked for the ability to just ask the province. Can we have exclusion zones for certain areas, right, to get us through, because the cost to build the infrastructure could be prohibitive for all buildings. And then my other question is, have we thought about, so I take it there's, so 248th is gonna get, if I'm looking at the map correctly. So 248th is gonna be, it doesn't go through already.
It doesn't go through today, it will,
Okay.
it will be constructed as part of a development application that's not quite showing a little bit north of where your finger is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this will connect.
Yeah.
And so when I look at the major corridors going out 112, 248 to 104, or 248th and then down McClure. Do we have, like, what is our thought going forward as we look at building out this area? As how are we going to safely get people in and out of there? How are people safely gonna get to their schools? Because the reality is the school's not gonna be built for decades. And so these kids are going to school west of 224th at this point. Like, how are we getting people in and out in a safe way? Because 112 is not a safe road, and I can tell you McClure needs some serious work, because it is a scary road to be on, and 104th, I think, is also of need of some significant speed reduction thought.
So as part of this work, the major entrances and exits from Northeast Albion, if you will, from a westward perspective, will remain the existing road. So it'd be 112 that would be down south to 104th or McClure. And those that feel like it can certainly go up through 252 that way. We've had some conversations with the school district about where the future catchment area for this area will be. They're aware of the density that's coming into this place in advance of the construction of the school. So they have some thoughts about how they will be able to redistribute the students, recognizing, I believe Blue Mountain might have a little bit of capacity, so they're aware of it. But yes, there will likely be some traffic considerations at peak hours in the short term within that area, particularly while construction is ongoing. I would note that our strategic transportation plan does have a longer term view. So this initial plan was done while the SCP was being underway. So we, should an OCP amendment move forward, that is an opportunity to kind of bring those two documents together. And if there are any further changes to the road hierarchy or options, we can do that, but it is a geographically constrained area in terms of, like, we're not punching another road through a park, right?
And I think that's always why I've struggled with putting density in this area, because it really truly doesn't. It's well, you look at the cost for the infrastructure to support it. And so, sure, people want townhouses because they think it's more affordable. When you start looking at the infrastructure to support that townhouse, the townhouse is no longer affordable or attainable for anyone. So I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, thank you.
Councilor Tan.
Thanks, Mayor. I appreciate the work that staff have done this. I'm sure it's a little bit of a complicated dance on this one. I am curious, just maybe some parameters contextual for me, you know, I feel like I understand that these estimates are Class D estimates, are just conceptual at a conceptual level. I feel fairly confident that the 30 million will be, it wouldn't go, I assume it'll be around that ballpark. It may not go down to 15 million, maybe 33 or 28, but I feel like I have enough information here to sort of make a general preliminary analysis. I too have never been a huge fan of this project, you know, I've been very clear that I've supported walkable neighborhoods close in the downtown, in the town center. That's my primary focus. We are here, and it's just been you know, changes in concepts over the years of how to build out, and this is not necessarily where I wanted to go, and so where. And I understand, and at the same time, I'm balancing the housing crisis, and at the same time, this is not where I necessarily wanted to go. And so where I'm at is I think my stance around this is let's put the housing in that doesn't require a substantial infrastructure. Like at this point, we're built into this area. There's some infrastructure out there that I'm not interested in $30 million. Whatever level of density that this infrastructure with some maybe minor upgrades and more or less support. And like, let's focus on development somewhere else. That's where I'm at. So I'm curious, maybe if staff could elaborate for me for concept 3. Could you elaborate for me sort of what the in the cost implications would be for that level of density?
So under concept 3, it is assumed that it would be able to be constructed under the existing level of infrastructure in place today, either in ground or captured through our standard servicing and upgrade process. So there will be a latecomer fee because many of those properties aren't currently attached to the city sanitary system. Through the rezoning process, they would become part of the sanitary system. So that cost would be, it's a known quantity. We already have development applications that are utilizing it. So there isn't any, well, it is our understanding that at this point in time, concept 3 would not require anything above and beyond which would already have been asked of development applications already in the area.
That's wonderful. That's I appreciate that. So that's kind of where the road I want to go, because as I look at, I appreciate the elaboration of the challenges here, you know, like sewer, being like stormwater mobility to Councilor Carreras' point, you know, drinking water, fire flow, sewage collection, like it's just like it's a list, right? Like, and I'm not particularly interested in. It's a list, right? We have a lot of challenges, like this is not necessarily where I should go money into. And I think so maybe in terms of, yeah, just enough density to sort of where this infrastructure needs that we can support, and then let's move on. Let's move on. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilor Schiller, then go back to Councilor Duick.
Okay, yeah, I mean, essentially, I'm supportive of as much, you know, diversity and affordability as we can provide without opening up this whole need to you know, I think the area plan was designed for a certain number of units, and that's what we built for, and I think to a great extent, I would just prefer to go to that if the provincial changes are allowing some increased density that we can support, if concept 3 allows for some different unit types. And that we can work with the infrastructure that we have, then I think that's great. But so some of my colleagues have already said, I sort of struggle to see how this is the area to put increased density in, because it just seems like the costs that are gonna go along with it are really gonna eat away at any sort of affordability gains that we might make. And it is not the initial cost even of the infrastructure that concern me, but the long-term maintenance of it. So I'm very appreciative of staff of kind of taking that step back and just like looking at the big picture, like, does this make sense? For me, I don't really feel like it does, and I don't see, I think we have other opportunities that would serve us better to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I jump to second round, I'll just say for me, I am struggling because I don't think the initial recommendation is something that I can support at this time. Just because there's a lot of information that's not available, and for me, I think that we need to get more information from all the comments that we've been hearing today before we can make that kind of a decision. Councilor Duick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess for me, I definitely need more information from this perspective. If we do anything and keep single family, as is in the hybrid on the west of Fort Gates, it doesn't mean that the infrastructure concerns that are being raised around the table are gonna go away, because if those single family units put a suite, a detached garden suite, or a fourplex, whatever under Bill 44, that's going to increase it significantly as well. So there's that piece. The other piece is looking at a multifamily type unit, we actually can maintain, in my humble opinion, better the environmental features, the livability of the area, it far greater than in single family homes. The the other piece around, I can't support this, well, back in October, we should have signaled that then. Cause it was a unanimous vote to send staff away to look at this. So we spent 7-8 months of staff time, resources to pull this together, public feedback. If we were not looking at doing something different than what already existed, we should have said so then. So there's a couple lessons learned here. The infrastructure piece moving forward, we should know that before we ever go out and review an area plan again. Number one. Number two, council shouldn't have signaled it to go ahead if the intention wasn't to support a different density. Because what was the point? If regardless of whether I supported the Albion plan in the initial stages, it was already underway when I got elected in 2002. I personally wouldn't have supported that back in the day. There was rationales why it was there. The bridge was gonna be there, West Coast Express was there. There was a reason for it. Unfortunately, that changed. But now we have the existing area. So to me, it makes sense to complete it. It makes sense based on the analysis that the public have shared with us. The school being across the street, we have no idea when the school is going to go in, but you know, if there's more density around that area, there'll be more pressure, and that's where we can help advocate with the school district to the province. No guarantees it's going to be in place, but so I'm you can sense I'm a little frustrated with this one. I'm very frustrated with this one, but I don't think by not going away and getting more information that it's going to address the infrastructure, because Bill 44 could change that area significantly.
So can I just ask you the question then? Which one are you suggesting?
The alternative recommendation.
Okay, so
Yes.
I've got you all mixed up then.
No, this, but also signaling based on townhouses as was presented to the public in option 1.
Okay, so you're supporting option 1.
Yes.
Okay, that's not clear as to which one that you were supporting, so, okay, makes sense.
I'm not supporting option 3. I'll make clear on that one. Which is
Fair
the
enough.
hybrid that was not presented to the public.
So for clarity's sake, you would support the alternate recommendation?
Yes.
Okay, all right, okay. Went around in circles there, I think I got to where I need to go. Councilor Carreras.
Thanks. I think when it was asked to go back, the rationale around going to relook at it is because the market had changed and they wanted to look at single family homes transitioning to townhomes, which was more of the interest. And I think that was the question that was asked back in the day is, do you support looking at townhomes instead of single family homes? Yeah, I actually, though I don't like it, I still think I'm fine to look at townhomes. But what changes it for me today is the significant cost we are adding to those houses with having to upgrade the infrastructure needed to support that. And I think that's the piece that we didn't know back in the day when we were asked to move forward that we do know today. And that's the piece that makes it much more complicated for me to really say which one is which. I mean, if we move forward with concept 1, that still equals the upgrade and the infrastructure.
Concept 1 in and of itself would require infrastructure upgrades. If we were to move forward the alternative recommendation under the parameters of concept 1, that would shape quite clearly what the analysis would be done under.
Yeah, and again, in fact, where I was before is like, I'm fine with more townhomes and houses, but I think that if we need to upgrade the infrastructure to support the townhomes, then we're adding a significant cost on those townhomes that make it, the dollars won't work for it for folks, and I think for builders too. So honestly, I don't know if I can give direction moving forward, because I don't actually truly know which way to go with the 3 concepts, except that how do we best build that area out without significant increases, or if we're going to do significant increases, what does that true impact look like? And if we do move forward and do the infrastructure, are people even going to build at the price point? I mean, that's the thing, is if we say no, we need more density, and then we add, what is it, $65,000 or $100,000 to it, does that just all building, like I don't have these answers to be able to give you which concept I wanna go forward with. But that's where I'm complicated is, yeah, back in the day, because you said we should have signaled, well, back in the day, I was happy to say, yeah, sure, let's look at townhomes that are more affordable, but it's today, so you're right, we should have looked at the infrastructure. Support before we even looked at any of this, because that really is the that really shapes my decision as to how we move forward. Is that cost?
Marlene, you wanna jump in?
Please, I just want to clarify that in standard land use analysis or preparing neighborhood plans, standard procedures to determine density comes first, and then infrastructure requirements follow. So just wanted to let you know that this process followed standard procedures, because we don't know how large the pipes need to be in the ground until we know how many units or the types of land development, such as heavy industrial, light industrial, and commercial uses would be determined. A second thing to consider is that taking this analysis to the next level of detail so that we can confirm the costs more accurately will determine whether or not it's 75,000 or 125,000 per unit additional cost to service it under the new density. What it will do is provide the developer with the information to do the pro forma. And it is the developer, no matter who it is, will determine whether or not it's cost effective, and they can actually build and market these homes in the standard fair market value. So even with proceeding with this, council won't actually have a finite answer as to will it be single family or SMU type housing or townhousing. But you have provided the industry with the information that they need to determine what type of housing can be built there and marketed there.
I think the challenge we're faced with, if we could go back 20 years, I think we could fix a whole bunch of things, right? But that's not the way life works. We have an opportunity in front of us if we start thinking about future planning, municipality, that what is this area going to look like? We know we need more densification. I support townhomes. You know, the way of the single family home, unfortunately, isn't a sustainable piece to it, right? So if we look ahead 20 years to that area, what's it going to look like? Are we going to have to build anyways? And if we are, is that cost going to be skyrocketing in 20 years cost? This is something we need to think about as an exercise is, do we plan for the past or do we plan for the future? And I come back to, I don't have enough information, whether it's 1, 2, or 3. I will go for something that has more density because that's what we need. Now, how did that fit into this picture? I don't have that information enough. If it's $30 million, what's it going to look like? Ultimately, the market will dictate whether a developer wants to spend the money to do that, what kind of project it's going to be. But our job is to start thinking of that future, right? Or are we going to leave the same types of problems we see today for future councils? This is where we're stuck, and this is why we're stuck here. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Councillor Chan.
Thanks, Mayor, I appreciate that. And I think I hear this about the level of like the end of the inventory around this room and on stopping this. Certainly a lot of things have been solved 20 years ago. I think where I'm at is that it is a bit of a struggle for me because when we discussed this earlier in Ontario, there was the question asked around the table, what are the infrastructure costs going to look like? And at that point, like the standard procedure was that we'll just give the blessing and then like we'll sort of figure out the infrastructure costs from there. But I think that it does probably signal that we'll be okay at any price point. Maybe that some folks maybe, the folks who have invested interest in this may take that as that sort of signal. And I think the reality was that none of us necessarily intended to give that signal that at any infrastructure price point like that was going to be okay. That was going to be okay around the table. And I would be interested in exploring the future, how we can massage our standard operating procedures so we don't have this kind of surprise again at a council table, that leads to, frustration for all parties involved. Because like it is, I mean, the reality is that like $30 million here, this neighborhood would use it, $30 million elsewhere would go a very long way, so like when we're looking 20 years in the future, do I want to invest $30 million in this neighborhood or in other neighborhoods, right? And like in looking 20 years ahead, like many neighborhoods could use that $30 million. So I see it as let's make sure the infrastructure is in place for the homes that we already have, the single family homes, as Councilor DeWitt mentioned already. We've built 44, like the best kind of modeling estimates that we have. And then like my take is our limited infrastructure dollars needs to go where there will be ultimate benefit for it. And that is, we have many other projects, and so in terms of what specifically to recommend, I can say that like I would be very surprised I do not see myself supporting an infrastructure cost of $30 million. I don't see, there are very few universes where I can see that as a
I'm
possibility.
gonna stop you for a second because I know Scott wants to reply to that.
So just for council's clarity, the $30 million infrastructure costs for lift stations and water stations, it's a cost of development. It's borne by the developers, not borne by the corporation. And so that is part of this. So what we would be doing is coordinating the design with the developer, but it's not incumbent upon 100,000 residents to bear those upfront costs. We may upfront it, but we would back charge to the developer upon hookup. So those costs are not borne by the taxpayers, they're borne by the developer to light up the area. And that's one of the reasons why. So it's not you deciding, do you want a swimming pool or do you want sewer water system? It's two totally separate pieces. This is the cost that we would charge to the developer to hook up their development to our infrastructure. What staff's suggestion is that we need to refine that number so that we can have a more informed conversation with council and more informed conversations, as Amanda has pointed out, with the pro forma that the developer would looking for when they decide to approach on a pre-application meeting of this is what I'd like to build here. They would know upfront what that expense is going to look like for them to bear. It's not borne by the corporation, not borne by 100,000 taxpayers. It's borne by the developer upon the
I
application.
appreciate that. I appreciate this department. So maybe like more information. So that's very good information. So maybe more coming back about what that would look like for the municipality. We're gonna have a conversation later tonight that if the city is gonna show there a higher percentage of capital costs because the DCC costs aren't as high as we want it to be. Like there's a lot of moving. So I want to understand what the costs of the corporation are on this. And so, and I also want to understand the infrastructure maintenance costs, as Councilor Schiller pointed out, because the upfront cost is one thing, but who's maintaining the pump stations? That's us. And so having a sense of what those dollars are into the future, into the 20 years as a year, what that's gonna cost, because like that money can go many other places. So that is something I want to understand. And I just I didn't want to say that, I appreciate that like steps were taken in the past and we are here where we are. And also like in terms, like we haven't promised that, everyone a chicken dinner around here, it's like where I still look to where we are putting our staff resources, where we are putting our money. And like given the strategic plan of this council, we wanted many things. And in terms of neighborhood density, like it was the town center and it was the LD cafe. And it wasn't. So in terms of additional staff resources, let's fulfill our obligations, let's do what we committed to doing. And then let's spend Amanda's valuable time on the places that on the priority projects. So that's it.
I just want to quickly respond to that. Because it's not a simple issue of saying, well, let's not go there and develop.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, that is one of the things that we're in front of. But if I'm reading the room correctly, I think there's a consensus to go for the alternate recommendation. If that's the case, can I get a motion to, because we can't make a decision to vote anyways, but can I get a motion to move the alternate recommendation, moved by Councilor Dewitt, seconded by Councilor Carreras, okay, Councilor Youssef. Any questions? Final comments on this one? I mean, if I'm reading the room wrong, tell me. But it seems to me this is where we want to go. Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the alternate recommendation, motion is carried unanimously. Thank you. It's a lot of information for sure, and a lot of yeah, we'll have to figure this piece out as we continue to move forward. Okay, I know we have lunch here, but I'm looking at Katerina, and you think you have about 10 minutes?
Yeah, if you wanna have lunch first, we'll be fine.
No, let's go through,
No, okay.
let's plow through that, then we'll go into close and we'll take a break and go get lunch.
We don't wanna keep you waiting till like on and on.
This shouldn't be huge.
Hopefully.
Okay,
You've been
so,
very patient with that.
so we have item 5.3, item 5.3, Union of BC Municipality Ministers Meetings.
Great.
You have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor and Council, pleased to be reviewing some planning for UBCM 2024 and BC Cabinet meetings in particular. So as everyone knows, each year UBCM organizes their annual general meeting and their policy conference. This year is taking place September 16th to the 20th. And as usual, includes the opportunity to meet with cabinet ministers. And so we are working towards gaining council's review and feedback on a series of meeting requests that will be aligned in terms of strategic priorities. And the deadline to submit the meeting requests is Friday, June 21st this month. So staff are requesting council feedback on proposed meetings and discussion topics for this year. The last year's meetings and discussion topics has been attached for reference. Before we get into that though, just a very quick, some quick reminders on the parameters for the cabinet level meetings. So they will be in person, 15 minutes in duration, so high level, and 5 minutes is left in between meetings. We may cover up to 3 topics, and the meeting times are in your report here, Monday through Thursday, 8 AM to 5:30, and Friday, 8 AM to 11. It's also important to note that, of course, there are more meeting requests than the province is able to accommodate depending on the ministry. And that the meetings are based on different criteria. And that we are encouraged to not submit the same topic to multiple different ministries or ministers. The chart outlined in the report goes over the proposed list of meetings and discussion topics for your consideration with BC cabinet ministers. As I mentioned, we did attach an appendix recap from last year, just so you can see. So the 2024 meetings and issues are based on reflecting on 2023. And they are also inclusive of some items that we're carrying forward that haven't, fully been addressed or are ongoing and are reflected for your consideration. So as mentioned, the final meeting requests will be submitted June 21st. And, we know that this is a great way to give voice to some of the local issues that you all hear day to day. And so looking forward to your feedback on the proposed meetings and topics.
Okay, thank you very much. You all have a copy of the list of ministers. So I'll just add on to that. Yeah, 15 minutes, not a lot of time, right? So short, sweet, get in, roll up the sleeve and get it done. So any comments or questions onto the list or Councilor Carreras?
Thank you for doing this. I do find even though 15 minutes, these meetings can be quite impactful. I'm fine with the list. There's a couple of things, and I don't know if it's applicable to Minister Ma. We have diking and emergency preparedness. I wonder if we want to put emergency access and evacuation on there. Which though we're talking about the Silver Valley Bridge with Minister Fleming. When it comes to emergency, that is a big piece for us, whether it's floodings or fire. With Minister Kahlon on housing, instead of supportive housing partnerships, I'm wondering if we want to talk about non-market housing partnerships, because that talks more about the range, like we're not talking about sort of supportive housing that we're seeing on the ground here, but that what does non-market housing look like? And I'm wondering if we also want to put on there something about the new legislation impacts, because that's probably the biggest thing that's happened for the Minister of Housing since the last meeting. And then again, with Minister Bailey, I'm sure we're gonna talk about it, is the option and the availability of possibly opening up 256 and how that could be such a significant piece of industrial land for the Lower Mainland, which they're very, very desperate for, but there are some barriers for us to light that up. And then the other one that's not on here, but I think we continue to talk about it, including this earlier today, is Minister of Education. We're really, really struggling. I mean, for me at the table, making decisions around developments, knowing that these kids have nowhere to go, it's quite a problem now. You know, Yenadin is almost 800 students, which is way too large. So Silver Valley and the northeast Albion one, but even the extension, SRT needs an extension. Like those are the three key things. So that's the only one I would suggest. The rest of it is great. Thank you so much for putting that together and thinking about us.
Councilor Tan.
Thanks, Mayor. Just to add to what Councilor Carter said, for Rob Fleming, I would be interested in discussing the BRT line. What Trent came in and talked us about the many sort of things that we want along the BRT line, and so that would be wonderful if we can, get this forward and making sure that all the things that we want, like, and what would active transportation and sidewalking and like how do we do that in a responsible way if it's, if possible, like let's have that discussion. And the other one with Minister Cowling, with support positive non-market housing partnerships and then the BC Builds project and just like leveraging that. With Mr. Whiteside, I'm curious about PACE teams, like whether we can get one of those peer assisted care, whatever it stands for, PACE teams and have, I think there were two municipalities that were the last time.
New West.
There were two spots, there were two more municipalities that were gonna be gifted PACE teams. And so it would be wonderful if we were one of them, like those peer assisted care, whatever ministry funded ministry dollars in our community, let's get some of that or whatever other supports them. Yeah. Great.
Thank you. For sure.
Thank you for the list, and yeah, I guess I'm just interested, if anyone else, would support, or see a need to meet with Energy Minds and Low Carbon Innovation. I just think back to our meeting, with them last year about the fish ladder and, BC Hydro and our engagement. I feel like we had some very specific asks. I'm not personally satisfied that they've really been addressed. So I don't know that this is the right forum then to bring it back again, but I just wanted to put it out there.
Yeah, I agree. Last year when we met with the energy minister and BC Hydro, we were very clear on some things, and we're hearing some maybe progress, maybe not progress, hard to say, but this would be our opportunity to, all right, what's going on? I also want to bring up our energy needs for 256 and make sure that we have sufficient energy for all of our other industrial areas that we are working on. Even when they came last week, everybody's doing a little dance, right? I don't want anybody dancing. I want to know, I want answers. And I think that's the opportunity to do that, to get there to do that.
Mayor, thank you. Thanks, Mayor. One more thing for mental health and addictions around the very LMLA, we had those wonderful presentations with Surrey Fire and was it Ellsworth who talked about the second response? Surrey, and then
New West is the other one.
New West, the one where fire response to an overdose call, and then the next day Fraser Health, or was it Fraser Health that follows up and then knocks on the door and says, hey, she overdosed yesterday. These are all the resources we can provide as a public health agency, like here are resources, do you want to sign up? When the Surrey was talking about a 30% sign up rate, 30% visitation, something along those lines, and what a wonderful way to do it. So like having some sort of provincial support for that kind of program, and all these other guys are putting that's great. So I'm sorry, there's not a succinct way to put that category in, but it's all the second response, I think. Second response, because it's health and safety for the staff. Yeah.
Hey, any other comments or additions?
Thank you. Hot teams, PACT.
It's Victoria, Vancouver, and New West.
Okay.
We had a presentation at FCI on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Good. Done. Confirmed.
Yeah.
Good. Any other final or comments? Seeing none, we have a recommendation on the board. Can I get a motion to move this recommendation? Moved by Councilor Chiller, seconded by Councilor Carreras. All right, all those in favor? Motion is carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Okay, the only item we have left is a notice of closed meeting. Can I get a motion to do that? Moved by Councilor Tan, seconded by Councilor Schiller. All those in favor? Thank you very much. We'll recess and